Okay, this feels like a guy who just needs like a therapist or a wife. Does he have a wife? Is
Yeah,
he married?
like,
It feels like
oh,
he
I
needs.
actually don't know.
It feels like he
Oh, he has
needs.
to be married, yeah, because his son rules after him.
It feels like he needs someone that is trusted and can very kindly be like, "You're going about this in the exact wrong way." Hey, welcome back to Antisocial Studies and the part two of Emily Learns About the English Civil War. I have with me Emily Poole. Emily, do you want to introduce yourself again?
Yeah, so my name is Emily Poole, and I teach in Denver, Colorado, and I'm teaching Emily about what's going on in Stuart, England.
Yeah. Last time, for those of you who are just joining us, last time Elizabeth died. Her, I don't know, nephew once removed or cousin once removed or whatever, James comes down, doesn't get the memo that England has a Magna Carta and a parliament now. He just like tramples all over everyone. And then Guy Fieri tries to blow up Parliament. That's what Guy Fawkes, but I thought it was Guy Fieri. So, and now we have James's son Charles is ascending to the throne.
Yes.
Okay,
And Charles, like his dad, wants to rule absolutely,
okay,
does not want to work alongside Parliament and would rather make all of his own decisions. Charles, especially, considering England in the 1600s, is like, hey, you know what I want to do? I want to get involved in some wars, specifically wars against Spain and France.
right,
Emily, why does England get in some wars with Spain and France?
okay. So Spain is Catholic, and Spain has been trying to get rid of like the Protestant leaders for a while. Partly because like King Henry VIII totally screwed over his first wife, who was the daughter of the Spanish king, right? She got like sent off to Ireland or whatever. But I think they're still like salty about losing the Spanish Armada.
Yes.
Okay, and then France, they've just always hated each other. I think, and I know this from Monty Python, but like they've always gone back and forth, and I feel like we're also in the midst of this age of exploration, and we're all trying to get involved. This is probably where you're trying to get me to go before now, but we're all trying to like fight over North America and some wars and stuff, and so we know if we beat, we're being England, if we beat these other places, we might get some land other places around the world.
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Power, money, and like you mentioned, religion, right?
Mm-hmm.
Spain and France are both Catholic. England at this point is Protestant.
Right. Okay.
So Charles comes up, is trying to fight in these wars, is trying to make England more powerful. And he, like his father, wants to raise money without Parliament's consent.
Okay.
And Parliament is like, we're not going to do this. You have to use us to, like, we're the power of the purse. You have to use us
It's
in
like
order
their
to.
one power they have.
Yes. So whenever he'll like call Parliament into session, Parliament, and then he's like, hey, make this new tax for me or raise this new tax for me, and they're like, no, and he's like, okay, well, goodbye. Like, I'm going to dissolve you. So he tries to come up with other ways to raise taxes so that he can fund these wars, specifically through selling aristocratic titles.
Oh.
And through this old tax called ship money, which is like this medieval tax that he reinvigorates. And ship money was a tax that different areas and like kind of countries and or not country counties in England had to pay to the monarch for defense in the medieval ages.
I remember this from my grad school class now. I remember being like, my professor did not explain it this well. And I remember being like, why are we talking about ships so much? Okay.
So it was this tax that was like raised for defense, and Charles is like, "Oh, we're going to war. We need this tax for defense. Like, let me restate ship money as a tax." So
Right.
he tries to get money in all of these very creative ways. Parliament is like, "No, no, no, that's not okay." So in 1628, Parliament's like, "Hey, I'm going to force this king." Wow, Parliament forcing a king to do things. Does that sound like anything in England history?
The Magna Carta.
Yes.
You just made me really nervous. I was like, oh, good.
So there's this Parliament forces Charles to sign this thing called the Petition of Right, which is essentially saying, hey, like, you can't tax without our consent. Like,
yes.
That is what we're here for. Don't do it. Charles is like, fine, I'll sign it. And then Charles ignores it, and then he dissolves Parliament. Classic.
Which
Charles.
is kind of like what King John did with the Magna Carta, right? He then was
Yes.
like, I'm just going to ignore this now. Okay.
Yeah, and lucky for England, King John died like a year or two after he signed the Magna Carta. So I feel like that actually like enabled the Magna Carta to take root in England.
Yeah.
Because they got a new ruler who was like, oh yes, this is the thing that we do now.
Right.
So after this, Charles tries to rule absolutely, but then the 30 Years' War is happening in Europe, and he gets involved in the 30 Years' War. So, long story short, Emily.
Yada, yada, yada.
Parliament convenes every now and then, and they're like, hey, we need to pass this thing called the Triennial Act, which is going to say that Parliament has to get called into session every 3 years, regardless of whether or not the king calls us into session, just to keep the peace.
For context, from we talked about this the first episode too, but like for context, up until this point, Parliament just gets called whenever the king wants them to come. So Parliament can like not be called for 10 years or whatever.
Yes.
And so this is an important step because I think when we think of Parliament, we think about like the modern day like US Congress or something that's like always there. But that was not the way it was. Okay.
Correct. Yeah, so they're trying to make themselves that way. They're trying to say, hey, like you have to call us regularly. And also, like, you can't just dissolve us anymore. You cannot be adjourned. Like, we cannot be adjourned without Parliament's own consent. The king can't just say, like, you're dissolved now. Charles, in the midst of this meeting, enters the House of Commons to end the session. He's like, I'm just going to dissolve you anyway. He also tries to arrest a bunch of members or ministers of Parliament. And he's wildly unsuccessful. And he's run out of the House of Commons. And he's like, oh, no, this is bad. I just alienated myself against Parliament. So Charles is like, well, shoot, what do I do now? I'm going to head north to Scotland and I'm going to get myself an army.
Charles is a Protestant?
Yep.
Yeah, so it's like, why? This didn't have to be this hard. Like, it's so weird to me because for James and Charles, it didn't have to be this hard. Like, all they had to do was keep doing what had already been done, and probably Parliament would have, I'm sure they would have been fine to go fight the 30 Years' War to try to win more land or whatever. Like, right?
Maybe they weren't like directly involved in 30 Years' War, but like, yeah, they would have been fine.
Like, it just seems like these are two very arrogant men who are walking in and like, it's like it could have been so much easier if they had just been willing to like give an inch, right?
Right.
Okay.
Like concede something. And the English monarch is essentially ruling absolutely anyway. Elizabeth can do what she wants to do. She just has to ask Parliament for money. Come on.
Yeah.
Like, it's really not a bad thing.
No, this is silly. This is silly, Charles. Okay, so he goes to Scotland, which is his, I guess, homeland, although he probably grew up most of his life in England. And he's just like, I'm just casually gonna raise an army that's different from the British. It seems like he's committing treason against himself.
Emily, you might be like getting a little ahead of yourself.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Okay, so what happens now?
Charles heads north to form his army. And in 1642, this English Civil War officially starts.
Okay.
So we have two groups emerge. Group number one, those that support the king and his power. And then group number two is those that support the Parliament and a limitation on the king's power.
Okay.
So group number one, supporters of the king, sometimes called royalists, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
They're also called the Cavaliers. And that is because the people who were in the Cavaliers had enough money to have a horse. Oh. So Cavaliers, that's where that comes from. So people who can afford a horse for combat.
Cool.
Cavaliers are generally going to be the House of Lords, the aristocracy, large landowners, church officials, rural people.
Oh, and rural people?
Yeah.
That's weird.
Is it?
I don't know. It seems weird. It seems weird that you're like, if on the side of the king, it's like in this corner we have, and it's like you have all these like elitists, right? The like old school traditional powers, like the church, the aristocracy, the landed elite, whatever. And then to have like basically rural peasants. Why would they be on that side?
I am going to ask you to draw a comparison in just a second.
Okay.
So we got the Cavaliers, wealthy old landed aristocracy, etc. Then we have the parliamentarians, also sometimes called the Roundheads because they had a rounded helmet.
Oh.
So called the Roundheads, which is going to be the House of Commons, a lot of Puritans, which is like a pretty radical Protestant sect, merchants, townspeople, and more urban people.
Growing middle class. It's almost, it is like these like traditional values versus a little bit more like maybe progressive or whatever ideas.
Right.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, this is, Hobbes grows up during the English Civil War and like experiences the bloodshed, and then like as a result of that, becomes this like very strict enlightened philosopher. And this is all like right on the precipice of the Enlightenment. So it's really interesting to see how these things will then these ideas will then later play out in Europe and also in, across the world.
Well, and a really interesting comparison that I've talked about before is that like Hobbes, and then Locke is a little bit younger, but kind of Hobbes and Locke, these English philosophers both come out of this. And to me, it's very similar to in China during like the Warring States period, right? Like when in the Warring States period, and that's when like Confucius and Lao Tzu and the legalist guy, when they all are coming up with their philosophies on how to govern, right? It's like when you have these moments of chaos, you have a lot of different answers of like, well, how should we prevent this in the future, right?
That is a great comparison.
Thank you.
Yeah, love it. So I'm not really going to talk about any battles in the English Civil War except for one of them.
Right.
I'm going to kind of leave it on a little cliffhanger. So English Civil War, long story short, the parliamentarians win. But there's one battle I want to talk about, and it is the Battle of Marston Moor. And this is a battle that becomes important because it is where we start to see the emergence of a young Oliver Cromwell.
Ooh, Oliver. Okay. And I know a little bit about Oliver Cromwell, but I know we're going to talk about him a lot in the next episode. So.
Yes. So, put a little pin in that one.
Yes.
We're going to come back to Oliver Cromwell later. But what I want to say is, essentially during this time, the Roundheads, and under Oliver Cromwell, he creates this new model army. And this new model army is an army that anyone can join. You don't have to be from the nobility class in order to come. And they all have matching uniforms. It's great.
Oh.
So, under Oliver Cromwell, toward the end of the English Civil War, Charles I is captured by the parliamentarians. And when he's captured, he's imprisoned, and Oliver Cromwell becomes this like Lord Protector during this interregnum period. But he tries to do more than that. And I think that this is kind of a great little stopping point.
Yeah, because, I was going to say, I was like, there's a few lessons from this. One, if you let a bunch of young men join a group and give them all matching uniforms, like, they'll do a lot for you. And I could be talking about the Boy Scouts, whatever. But a lot can happen. And then also, one thing I've learned about, like, revolutions, which is sort of what this... I mean, I guess it's not a revolution because Charles started it, but still, out of these movements, it's like... whoever then comes out on top and is like replacing what was essentially an absolute monarch, it's going to be real hard to get them to like step back down and just like go back to their house.
Oh, yeah.
Probably.
And that definitely happens in England.
Okay. All right. So in our final, it's a trilogy. This is a trilogy on the English Civil War. We're going to talk about Oliver Cromwell and what happens after the chaos in the military. Can I just ask, and it's okay if you don't know, how were they able to beat Charles's forces? It's probably just that most of England probably didn't like Charles at that point. So they just had probably more support, right?
Yeah, and I think that I don't know the answer. I'm not going to make up something.
Yeah, we're both not military historians. We're like, anyway, battles happen, D-Day, I don't know, whatever. Now, the social and political impact. So,
yes, exactly.
Okay, so on part 3, we are going to talk about the outcome of the Civil War, or like the aftermath of it. All right, till next time.